the power-hungry villain. An explanation, a little bit of a defense, and an exploration into the progress of this particular kind of villain. Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Joanna G. Holden and I am a fantasy author and author tuber, and today's video is actually the first in a new series here on my channel all about character types. Now, this video in specific is about villains, but I, across my channel at large, tend to interchange villain and antagonist because most writers across the board, newbies and veterans, know who the villain is, right? The big bad. But antagonist can be a bit of a more confusing term for people who have not been in the writing community quite as much, maybe are just getting started in their writing journey. So let me start this video off by saying that there is a difference between the villain and the antagonist. The villain of the story is evil, they're bad, they do bad things for bad reasons, they are a truly horrible person usually. An antagonist is simply the person opposing your hero. They're not necessarily evil by nature. They're not necessarily like the big bad of the story. They simply come in opposition to your hero. And depending on who your hero is, see, even hero and protagonist I use interchangeably just by nature, when honestly, there are a lot of protagonists who are not heroes. A hero is someone who does the right thing for the right reason, and the protagonist is just the person that we follow through the story, whether or not that is the case. So I hope that clears up anything. For the future of this particular series, I will try to distinguish between when I'm talking specifically about a villain versus talking specifically about an antagonist, or same for a hero and a protagonist. I'll try to be a little bit more clear in my specifications. This video is going to be a deep dive into the power-hungry villain type. Like I said, a little bit of a defense of this particular kind of villain because it is one of my favorites, and really a deep exploration into how this villain comes to be in real life and in stories. But before we get started into that deep dive, I just wanted to real quickly say that if you are interested in content related to fantasies and in particular fantasy series, then be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so that you know when the next video comes up. The notification bell is kind of important at this particular moment when I'm releasing this video because I'm about to have a baby and I'm not sure exactly when videos are going to be coming out. It's not going to be my typical, like every Saturday I release a video like I have been for 2 years. It's going to be a little bit more chaotic than that. So notification bell, very important. So just throwing that in there. Okay, back to the video. So the power-hungry villain. This is a kind of villain who shows up a lot in fantasy. This video was actually inspired by some criticism that I had seen floating around the internet and even heard from writer friends and seen in the writer community against the power-hungry villain. People have decided that this I want to take over the world type villain is the weakest of the villains. Why do people believe that this particular villain is very weak, that it is potentially the weakest of all of the villains? Most people who have said this have followed up with the explanation that this villain is weak because most people cannot relate to someone who wants to take over the world. This idea of, I want to take over, I want power, I want it all, it seems very foreign to the readers because most people don't walk around with this ambition of someday ruling their entire kingdom, ruling the nation, ruling the continent, ruling the world. It's just not an everyday type person's thought process usually. And honestly, when this is the motivation of a villain, I can completely agree with that. That is a very weak motivation for a villain, the motivation of I want to take over the world. However, does this mean that this kind of villain should not be used? And more importantly, does this mean that this kind of villain isn't relatable at all? And that is where I say absolutely not. In fact, I would argue that the I want power, I need power type villain is one of the most relatable characters out there. And if you want to know why, then keep watching. So we're going to get into part one of this video, which is the defense/explanation. And the first part of this part is goals versus motivation. Honestly, when it comes down to it, the large reason that people don't like this villain being the motivation of, I want to take over the world, or I want power, and that not being relatable, it's all based on a misunderstanding of goals versus motivation. This is because wanting to take over the world, wanting more power, wanting to exercise said power over others is not a motivation. This is where it falls flat. This is where it becomes completely unrelatable. Wanting to take over the world, wanting that power, etc., is a goal. A goal is something that you want to do. The motivation is why. And when you have a villain who wants to take over the world, and that is the motivation behind all the other crap that they do, especially if it's like super horrible, it will fall flat because most people are not motivated to do things that they do by this desire to rule the world. So say you're making a meal for your family. You have to go to the grocery store to get food to make the meal for your family. Going to the grocery store because you have to make a meal, technically that's not really the motivation. You're going to the grocery store as a task that supports the thing that you want to do, make the meal. The motivation is why you want to make the meal in the first place, which obviously is so that your family has something to eat. Do you see the difference? We want to do different things, like take over the world, because of our underlying beliefs, emotions, or needs. And most of those reasons are not obvious at first. It will take time and effort, and sometimes a therapist, to reveal those underlying wants. Part number 2 of part number 1 is the relatable motives that lead up to wanting to take over the world, wanting more power, etc., etc. So, relatable motives. Power is supposed to be a super weak motive because theoretically it's the least relatable of all of the motives. Most people don't wake up in the morning saying, I want power. At least that's not what we think that we think. We are actually thinking this thing all the time about wanting more power. We just use different wording. We don't think, I want power. We think, I want to be able to change this. A lot of times it will come across as, I wish I could stop this bad person from doing this horrible thing. Then everything will be okay. Or, I wish I could help this person or this cause to succeed because then everything would be so much better. I don't think there's a person alive who hasn't at one point or other thought, if I could affect change in this one area of myself, my family, my country, my world, things would be so much happier. A lot of times this is triggered by our emotions, how seeing a person or a happening will cause us to feel. Seeing someone stand up for a cause that we find truly motivating, that we really believe in, oh, that is so inspiring. But it quickly becomes frustrating when that person or that cause experience hindrances or are completely shut down, or worse, come to harm at the hands of someone else. It is even more frustrating when we want to help with that cause or help that person, and we can't. We are completely powerless. In those moments, we wish that we had the ability to affect change, to empower that person or that cause, or to get rid of the person or cause that are hindering it. And the flip side of that, seeing bad things happen, it makes us mad. Like, it makes us livid. And we want to do something. Sometimes we'll even fantasize about having the power in that moment to make that change. Maybe we're able to go up to that boss who is being horrible to their secretary and completely tell them off and have no consequences for it. We fantasize about ruining someone's life because of all the lives that they've ruined. And be honest, many of us, if not all of us, have at some point fantasized about causing harm, whether that be physical or emotional, to someone that we see causing harm to someone else. The emotions that seeing these kinds of things cause in us all make us think the same thing. I wish I had the ability to affect change in myself, in this person's life, in this circumstance. Things would be better if I could. So in our heads, it's not about power. We don't think of power that way. It's about the ability to affect change. It's about being able to change the things around us that we don't like, that stress us out, that cause harm in our lives, that are ruining our lives or someone else's, that are truly unjust, that hurt those we love. That's what it boils down to. For a villain, it is not always about power. It's about the ability to affect change. That's exactly why this is one of the most relatable motives of all, is because all of us have experienced at some point that deep desire, if only I had the power to change the circumstance, if only I could step in and intervene, everything would be so much better. The ability to just change things we don't like at will is a superpower. It's one that most people will never experience, but that we all dream about having. And if you give someone a strong enough reason to want it, or the hope that they potentially could have it, and they will do whatever it takes to get it. At their roots, villains are less concerned with power than they are concerned with control, with the ability to control their circumstances, change things they don't like. And we see why this happens when we look at the spiral of power hunger, which is our part 2. Let's look at it now. I've actually heard it said, and I'm trying to remember where I heard it said, but that power is more addicting than drugs. It is more addicting than money, because you are able to control everything around you. And that desire for control is something that's at the base of all of our human nature. And for this part, I'm actually going to read directly out of my notes because I really want to get the wording on this correct. And yeah, this is the best way to do that. There are 4 basic steps to the progression of any character from what we would consider normal to someone who is genuinely power hungry and who is genuinely evil. Whether or not they choose to go down that spiral depends very much on their own integrity and their ability to hold to morals and beliefs in the face of great temptation. Often the hero will face the same temptation to go down this spiral, and it will take everything in them to resist. A lot of times this is where we will see that old trope used of the villain saying, "You're not that different from me." And we can see it in the story where the hero and the villain face the same choice. It's just that the hero chose to resist the temptation or to take action in a different route, and the villain chose to go down this downward spiral of power hunger. Commonly, what makes the villain a villain is their choice to go down this spiral or their inability to resist that temptation. Depending on whether this person starts off as a good person or not, they will either begin with step 1 or, for less morally conscious people, possibly step 2, but it all starts with a single taste of power, control, the ability to change. And that is what part 2 is all about, the spiral downward into power hunger. And again, what makes this one of the most relatable motives ever. The first step is the desire for change, the desire to be able to affect change around us in our circumstances and in the circumstances of others. The thought process for this is that this person is bad, what they are doing is bad, having the power to keep them from doing that, or better, to put them away for doing that, is a good thing. It makes everyone safer, and it makes me a good person for utilizing that power in that way. On the flip side, you could say this person is good. The cause that they stand for is good. Having the power to be able to empower them to do this, or to keep them doing it, to keep them safe from people who would want to hinder them, that is a good thing. It is a good exercise of this power. It makes everyone safer. It makes me a good person for using this power that way. So we see at the very beginning, it can actually be a good thing. Having power is not necessarily a bad thing. It allows you to empower good people and to stop bad people. It allows you to make people safer and to put away the people that would harm others, that would ruin people's lives, that would cause mass destruction. That's where most people start on the spectrum when you are a normal person. You aren't looking at the power itself, you're looking at that desire to change things. You're wanting to stop the bad, horrible things from happening and help the good things to happen. I think honestly, and this is a complete side note, but I think honestly all of us right now are experiencing a little bit of this right now, this summer in 2020, where we wish so desperately that we could affect change around us, whether it be to stop something that we believe is bad from happening, or to help something that is good to happen more, or to allow it to be available to more people, or to encourage more people to do it. We all wish that we had more power to affect the circumstances around us, and we feel frustrated when we can't. That power to do good is not a bad thing, but it is the first taste of power, and this is where the spiral downward begins as we move into step 2. Step 2 is where you transition from desiring change for good and bad, and desiring change for people who are personally disagreeing with or hindering me, or whose cause I personally am benefiting from. This is where it goes from what's best for everyone to my own personal preferences. It goes from beliefs to opinions. It's no longer about this person is hurting other people, they need to be taken out of the picture. Or this person is helping so many people, let's get them on a platform where they can help even more. Now it's about this person disagrees with me on this issue, they need to be gotten rid of so that they don't hinder me from doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Or, oh, this person, they agree with me, we were on the same page, I like that, let's promote this person. It slowly stops becoming about what's best for everyone and slowly starts becoming about what's best for me. With a villain, a lot of times we will see this where, and we see this so often in movies where, or TV shows, where a villainous character, they're having a disagreement with one of their generals usually, and the other person is saying, we can't do this, like it's immoral. And the person's like, well, no, I disagree with you. We should be able to do this. And if the general pushes, then they have that general taken out of command because they are hindering what's best for everyone. This is where it starts becoming tricky too, because sometimes the things that you're disagreeing about are personal beliefs, which are kind of the foundation for our views of good and evil and what makes something that someone's doing bad versus what makes what they're doing good. We're getting into a more gray area where it's no longer about what we would imagine everyone could probably agree with as bad, like someone who goes around killing people probably needs to be put in jail, to something that's much more a personal thing, where we have different political views, or we have different religious views. And so what's happening is a question still of morals, yes, but now we're getting into more where there are two sides of it, and neither one is universally like everyone would agree this side is right, this side is wrong. And this is where a lot of villains will start off thinking what I'm doing is for the best of everyone without realizing that this person isn't trying to hurt other people. They're simply disagreeing with a view that this person has. And again, it can get very murky here. And that is where the spiral of power continues to go down. Because if you have the power to take out someone who disagrees with you or is hindering your movement forward in a cause that isn't necessarily quite as universal, or if you are able to say, this person and I get along well, I'm going to draw them into my personal circle and make them more powerful, then we see a descent into step 3. And step 3 is where it becomes completely arbitrary, where we go from this person is disagreeing with me or hindering me, I'm going to get rid of them, to I don't like this person. They annoy me. Let's just get rid of them. The person isn't necessarily doing anything that's affecting things badly. The person isn't necessarily hurting anyone or causing any problems. You just don't like them. The villain just doesn't like them. They just don't, their voice irritates them, or they think that they're ugly, or they don't understand why this person is in the room still, and they just get rid of them because they can. This is where the spiral to power becomes such a slippery slope, is because once you have a taste of that power and you realize that you can do something just because you can, that's when it becomes very difficult for the villain to even consider giving it up. Because let's all be honest, if we could do anything that we wanted just because we wanted to, wouldn't that be really hard to give up? This is where the villain starts becoming a villain as opposed to just an ordinary person. When they begin exercising huge amounts of power over simple tastes. It's not even like a personal belief or a personal conviction. This is like how I'm feeling today kind of stuff. And this is where a lot of the I want to take over the villain, or I want to take over the world villains tend to get a little bit weaker when we see them written up in books and made into movies, is because we haven't seen that progression so far. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But the next and final step in this spiral downward to a point where a lot of people would see a villain as being truly evil, almost completely unredeemable, if possible, in the morals of this particular story or the particular character who's telling it. Step 4 is where the villain is taking pleasure in the villainy itself. So step 3 is I'm doing it because I can. Step 4 is I'm actually doing the opposite of what I started off with. I am actually hurting people because I find pleasure in it. Because watching other people suffer at my ability to exercise control over them makes me feel good. Again, this is where we see a lot of our I want to take over the world villains emerging fresh out of the gate at the very beginning of a story, and why sometimes they may feel not particularly relatable. Because most people don't walk around just, flicking a finger and all these people die and oh, that felt so good to be able to just squeeze that life out of them. It's not really relatable. But again, if we understand how they got there, then that makes a very, very different story. And that is where I'm actually going to, spur of the moment here, break us into a part 3, which is the progression of the villain in the story. If you have an I want to take over the world villain, especially if it's a dark one type villain, this is where I believe a lot of people find trouble with relating to these villains. Is because, again, most of us have never been a Dark Lord in charge of tons of magical power. We don't relate to that I want to take over the world mentality. So how in the world are you supposed to make this kind of a villain relatable if you don't have the time to show their backstory? Now, there are 2 options to kind of consider when you're writing your story that can make this kind of villain more believable. The first is to go ahead and include this transition. I am doing that with one of my villains in a WIP where we actually see this character's progression from all the way in step 1, slowly over the course of many books, into step 3. We never quite pass the boundaries into step 4 other than for use of threatening other people, but we definitely are in that step 3 of this idea of doing things because they can. But we get to see them start off in a place at step 1 where what they're doing is not inherently bad, their motivation is not inherently bad, and we can kind of understand where they're coming from. Even though they are opposed to the hero of the story, which in this case actually is a hero, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are a villain. They start off as an antagonist. The hero and the villain kind of sort of want the same thing-ish. They want the same kind of thing for the circumstance, but they have very different means of getting there, and they honestly have very different views on why this needs to happen, which affects how they do things and then what their theories are on what will happen afterward, which are kind of important in this particular story setting. The second option is to see this change transpire in the past through dialogue and discoveries made in the present day of the story. So we don't have the villain sit down and have this whole long story about how I used to be just like you, but we pick up on some things through their dialogue that help us to understand they did used to be a little bit less aggressive. You can humanize them very quickly by showing little glimpses into who they used to be and how they got there. Even if they were never necessarily a good person to start with, you can kind of see through glimpses into their past how they might have gotten there. And thirdly, actually, I completely forgot about a third one, which a lot of people will do, is to show similar things happening in the hero's life and in their journey that they are having to make different choices. We see them come across something that is similar to a choice that the villain made a long time ago, and we see them resist the temptation or choose to walk away from it, or we see them make the same choice, regret it, and backpedal. You do have to be careful with this one because that whole you and I are not that different can get a little bit old. It's a little bit tropey. But I think also if you word it differently maybe and have it not come out in a monologue at the end of the book in the middle of the big battle, then I think it can be incredibly compelling. You just have to be a little bit more careful in your narrative choice. That's a whole other topic for a whole other day. So that, my friends, is the explanation, defense, and progression of the power-hungry villain, and why I hold that this is one of my favorite villains of all time, still to this day. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to click the like, and again, consider subscribing on the way out for more fantasy and series-related topics. I have a lot more fun ideas coming down the road for more character type revelations, whether it be through villains, heroes, love interests, best friends, sidekicks, henchmen, all different kinds of stuff. So be sure to keep an eye out for those videos coming. My debut novel, Snow Dust, a middle grade fairy tale retelling, is now available on Amazon. in Kindle Unlimited as well as in paperback, so you can go check that out in the description box below. Anything else you need to know about me and my books, upcoming books, all that stuff, it's in the description box below, as well as my social media links, where I do post more updates on my writing journey and quotes from other writers, things that I'm discovering along the way, that kind of stuff. As always, I hope you have an amazing rest of the weekend writing, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!